Why are you not streaming? I am now, bitch. So, yeah.
Over the years, I've done a lot of different projects, and I've probably worked with and made hundreds of different chemicals. Out of all of them, though, I think that I can say that there's just one that has always been my favorite. It's a chromium-based compound called chromochloride, and it's my favorite because I feel like it has almost all of the fun properties that a chemical can have. For example, it's toxic, carcinogenic, highly corrosive, and potentially explosive. It's also a highly volatile liquid, so it fumes like crazy, and it has a really nice color that's extremely close to blood. From this description, it might sound like one of the worst chemicals out there, but it really isn't. I mean, it is pretty bad, but on a scale of 1 to 10, where 1 is table salt and 10 is sarin nerve gas, I'd probably say it's around a 5. So it is dangerous, and it definitely has to be treated with respect, but it also doesn't make me constantly afraid of killing myself and everyone around me. In general, I've always found it exciting to work with the more dangerous chemicals, and I just find that chromochloride has a good balance between danger and fun. The last time that I made it or handled it, though, was a few years ago, and I've been really wanting to work with it again. So, just for fun, I've decided to make a whole bunch of it. To do this, I first needed a source of chromium, and the best thing to start with is something like potassium dichromate. This is a relatively common and cheap chromium-based compound, and I was able to buy a bunch of it from eBay. The second main ingredient that I needed was sodium chloride, which is just table salt. The salt in most grocery stores, though, has a bit of iodine in it, which might interfere very slightly with the reaction. I wanted to avoid this as much as I could, so I tracked down some pickling salt, which is basically just pure sodium chloride, and it should be completely free of iodine and any other additives. However, the iodized stuff honestly probably would have been just fine, and I doubt it would have really affected it very much. Now, to get things started, I added 100 grams of the salt to a cup, followed by 160 grams of the potassium dichromate. Then, with everything added, I screwed on the lid, and I put it into a magic bullet to blend it all together. For this reaction, the efficiency of it really depends on how well these two ingredients are mixed. The last time I did this, I tried just grinding it using a mortar and pestle, but I really don't think that it was good enough. This time though, by using a blender, it should give me an extremely fine and well-mixed powder, and I was hoping that it would make the reaction work better. After several minutes, I felt like it was good enough, so I stopped it and I flipped over the cup, and I tapped it a few times to try to knock down some of the powder.
I know!
Then, I opened it up again, and I was expecting a decent amount of dust to come flying
out, want?
But it was surprisingly tame.
No!
It was still important, though, to be really careful with it, and to not breathe in any of the dust, because potassium dichromate is both toxic and corrosive. With this powder mixture ready, I was able to move on to making the chromochloride, and I added it all to a large flask.
Is the YouTube stream actually online?
Then after that, I slowly put together the rest of the setup. I started by adding an addition funnel on the left, and I greased the joint using concentrated sulfuric acid to prevent any chromochloride from leaking out. Using sulfuric acid like this is pretty common when working with highly reactive chemicals, and I've done it a few times before, like when I was making pure nitric acid. To the middle joint, I added a 3-way adapter, and I just sealed the last one with a stopper. I then added a thermometer and a condenser column, and I used a clip to help keep
I need to pause it because I need to get my restream chat, so it's also on Control A, Control C, so it's also on this stream, or this thing. Let's see here, let's go with, it's browser, restream chat 2.0. Yeah, sure, that works. Control A, Control V. Okay. Now that's poggers. We'll just shrink that down so it's in the corner there. And then full screen. Play.
Attached. After that, I put together the other side of the setup, and I turned on the water recirculator to pump water through the condenser column. With everything now in place and pretty much good to go, I then added the final ingredient for the reaction, which was concentrated sulfuric acid. All of this acid was made a long time ago when I distilled it from drain cleaner that I got from the hardware store.
Chat's a little
I
small,
made a
but it's
video
okay.
on the whole process a few years ago, and if you're interested, there's a link in the description. In my opinion, though, distilling sulfuric acid is still one of the most dangerous things that I've ever done, and I really
Someone
don't
send a
recommend
message in
anyone
chat.
else to try it. I added as much as I could fit in the funnel, which was probably around 150 mils. Also, this acid was pre-chilled in a freezer for about an hour to make sure that it was cold. I think that it was probably somewhere around 0 C, but I didn't bother checking the exact temperature because it really wasn't very important. I was now finally ready to actually get the reaction started, so I slowly opened the funnel and added the sulfuric acid. The reaction started the moment that it touched the powder, and the beautiful red color
Jack,
of the
you know damn well I
chromochloride
haven't.
appeared almost instantly. What was initially happening here were two
that
separate
reminds me, I
reactions,
should
where
probably
the sulfuric
change
acid
my
was attacking the salt
Twitch
and
chat
the
category
dichromate.
to just
With
chatting.
the dichromate, the main product was chromium trioxide, and with the salt, the major one was hydrogen chloride gas. However, neither of these existed for very long, because the moment that they came into contact with each other, they reacted to form the chromochloride. This was why it was important to mix them as well as possible. The hydrogen chloride needs to come into contact with the chromium trioxide as soon as possible, or else it'll just boil off and escape as a gas. To a certain extent though, no matter how well things are mixed, some HCl will always be able to escape. So, to compensate for this, I made sure to include a bit of extra sodium chloride. Both of these reactions can be combined into one overall one, and we can see here all of the side products that were being made. So, besides the chromochloride, this reaction was also producing potassium bisulfate, sodium bisulfate, and a bit of water. In general, all these reactions release a lot of heat, and if ice-cold acid isn't used, it can sometimes get out of control. It can also cause the chromochloride to start boiling on its own, which was something I really wanted to avoid. After adding all the acid, I let it sit for a couple minutes, and it seemed to be pretty tame. So, I added the rest of the cold sulfuric acid that I needed, and I didn't bother doing it through an addition funnel. I just dumped it all in directly, and then I resealed it with a stopper. This caused the reaction to start bubbling, and I think it was mostly from HCl gas being released. Before moving on though, I had to wait until the reaction settled down, so I just let it sit there for a bit. About 15 minutes later, I felt like it looked like it was ready, so I set it up with a heating mantle, and I cranked up the temperature. The goal here was to boil out the chromochloride and to separate it from all of the side products. The boiling point of chromochloride is 117 C, but everything here was probably already above 100 C, so I didn't actually have to heat it very much.
I can't do that.
Initially, even when nothing was coming over, the whole setup was still filled with a reddish yellow gas, which was able to escape out of the vacuum adapter. Most of this was probably just HCl gas, but by the color, I knew that there was at least some chromochloride in it. This meant that the gas was both toxic and corrosive, and it was really important to not breathe in any of it. It isn't very clear from any of the shots, but this was all done in a good fume hood to make sure that none of it made it into the room. To reduce the amount of gas that got out, I made an ice bath to try and condense some of the chromochloride. And at first, this did seem to work, but as the reaction flask got hotter and hotter, it started off-gassing more and more HCl gas. From the last time that I made it, I knew that this would happen, and I probably should have at least tried to set up some sort of trap for it, but oh well. When the chromochloride got to its boiling point, it started climbing the flask, and it eventually made it to the cold condenser. This turned its vapor back into being a liquid, and what looked like blood started dripping over into the other flask. The idea now was to just keep it going at a steady rate like this, and to wait until pretty much all the chromochloride passed over. At the peak of it, the entire flask and most of this side of the setup became completely red, but as it got closer to the end, the color slowly faded. Eventually, after about half an hour, it looked like there was very little of it left, and nothing was coming over on the other side. Even though
also,
it stopped,
Jack, it doesn't fucking matter that I'm using Wi-Fi for a stream. I'm fine with a delay.
Put a bit of insulation around it.
Forbidden grape juice.
I just didn't really feel like it was worth the time or the effort. I already had way more chromochloride than I needed, and I was okay
with losing whatever was still there.
Oh!
So to stop it, I just took away the heating mantle, and
Figure
I
something
waited
out.
about 30 minutes
How do
for
I
it
do
all
this?
to cool down. After that, I took off the flask with all the chromochloride in it, and I sealed it with a stopper that I had pre-coated with sulfuric acid. Then, I took a closer look at it, and I noticed that there were a lot of solid chunks stuck to the side of the flask. I'm not
You guys
exactly
ready for
sure
me to
what
be
this was from,
loud?
but I think it was
Oh!
chloride reacting with moisture in
Is
the
this
air.
too loud?
To deal with this, I found that a good way was to just let it sit overnight and to give it time
Can I
for
just use
all the
volume
solid stuff
percent?
to separate
Oh, I can.
out.
Okay, cool. 200%
Then
mic
the next
audio.
day, I just had to filter it, and I did this by pouring it through a
Poggers.
funnel that was lightly plugged with a bit of glass wool. The moment that I poured it, it immediately started fuming like crazy and letting off a whole bunch of its nasty vapor. Thankfully, though, it all passed through relatively quickly, and I didn't have to leave it sitting in the open for too long. When it was done, the flask was again sealed with a stopper that was covered in sulfuric acid, and I used a clip just to make sure that it stayed on tight. The clip that I used here was the same metal one from before, but I really should have switched it to a plastic one. This is because even though the flask is sealed with a coated stopper, some vapor is still able to leak out and to corrode the things around it, especially metals. But anyway,
I
now
can
when
put
I
you
looked
in
at
a
the
timeout,
chromochloride,
whoopsie.
it was nice and clean, and there was none of that solid junk floating around or sticking to the side. I then weighed everything to figure out how much I had, and my yield was 112 grams. Based on the amount of dichromate that I started with, this was a percent yield of 67%, and it was way higher than I expected. The last time I did this, I got 52%, and I think it was
There,
way
now
lower
you guys can actually
because I
hear
tried
me.
mixing the starting chemicals just with a mortar and pestle.
Wait,
The
I'm gonna do
blender,
something.
though, was clearly a much better method, and it made things almost 30% more efficient. But anyway, I did make all this chromochloride just to look at it in this sealed
Oh,
flask,
that actually sounds
and
better.
it was now time to have some fun with it. To start off, I just pulled out a small amount of it, and I added it to a dish. In the pipette, it was so dark that it almost looked black, but the color was completely different when it was spread out in a thin layer. Instead, it was now this really nice and vibrant red, which I think really does look like fresh blood. However, unlike most normal blood, this was fuming like crazy and letting off a lot of toxic and corrosive vapor. Most of this vapor wasn't actually chromochloride though, because any chromochloride that was released quickly reacted with moisture in the air. This led to the formation of hydrogen chloride gas, which appeared white, as well as chromic acid, which was orange. As I let it sit there for a few minutes, it tried to slowly spread out more and to creep along the glass, but I'm not exactly sure why this happened. Clearly though, the chromochloride has some sort of affinity for the glass, and it likes sticking to it. To clean it up, I sucked up a bunch of
You
it,
to
and I put it
assume my
back in the
blood
flask.
doesn't fume.
Then to the rest of it, I added a solution of sodium sulfite, which is a mild reducing agent. This was able to quickly react with the chromochloride and bring it down from its angry and red 6+ oxidation state to its 3+ oxidation state, which is green, and a lot safer. At first glance, chromochloride can look really similar to bromine, which is another nasty dark liquid, and also one of my favorite elements. While I was making the chromochloride, I posted some videos to my Instagram story, and a lot of people thought it was bromine, and I really don't blame them. Even looking at it now, where I know for certain that it is chromochloride, it still does kind of look like bromine. This all made me very curious though, to see if there were some differences between them. So, I decided to do the same thing that I just did with the chromochloride, and to make a side-by-side comparison.
I'm drinking
The clip on the
soda.
left is just what we saw before, and the one on the right is the bromine. With the first few drops, it was possible to see its red color, which was much darker than the chromochloride. The color also didn't last for very long, and it quickly turned black when just a bit more was added. As it sat there, it just stayed as a relatively clean circle, which got smaller and smaller as the bromine evaporated. It also didn't really stick to the glass very much, and it didn't have that creeping effect that we saw with the chromochloride. Some of the vapor that the bromine let off reacted with moisture in the air to make hydrogen bromide gas, but most of it just stayed as brown bromine. And in general, bromine is quite dense, so the vapor had a tendency to sink more and to move around a lot less. The results from this actually kind of surprised me, because I always thought that these two chemicals were almost indistinguishable. And while this might be true in some cases, like if you're looking at it in a distillation setup, this definitely isn't the case in general. I think that now, if I ever saw a video without any context, I could probably tell the difference. When I was done, I took away most of the bromine, and like before, I added some sodium sulfite. Bromine's also a strong oxidizer and it quickly reacts with it, but it doesn't make a colored solution. It all just ends up becoming sodium bromide, which is a colorless salt, similar to sodium chloride.
Yeah, we're just making
The next thing that I
colorless
wanted
salt.
to try was to just add the chromochloride to some water. The moment that it touched it, it started reacting, and it made an interesting effect that I hadn't really seen before.
I can't tell if I'm supposed
After
to
doing
have...
this for
Oh,
a bit, I
okay.
tried to rest, and this time, it didn't get stuck on the surface, and it all quickly sank to the bottom. This again made an effect which I hadn't really seen before, and I thought it was pretty cool. Chromochloride is almost twice as dense as water, so it wants to just sit at the bottom. However, it also reacts with the water to make HCl gas that wants to float to the surface. I would have expected the bubbles to just escape and go on their own, but for some reason, they all stuck to the chromochloride. This caused a lot of them to just float to the surface, but some of them instead took their time and danced around for a bit. Every drop also had a very thin tail coming off of it, and it kind of looked like it was the thing that was propelling them. That almost definitely wasn't the case though, and as I said before, it was the bubble that was providing the upward force. In the intro, I mentioned that chromochloride was potentially explosive, but it really isn't a huge risk. On its own, it's just a powerful oxidizer, and for it to blow up, it needs to come into contact with certain chemicals under the right conditions. Most of the time, the worst thing that can happen is a
I'm
fire,
not that smart.
but that shouldn't even happen if you know what you're doing, and if you're being
hurting.
careful. I wanted to test this all out myself though, and I figured the first thing that I'd try was just burning it. So very
yes.
simply,
Just
I
burn
just
it.
put some on a watch glass, and then I blasted it with a torch. This caused it to very quickly start decomposing into mostly chlorine and oxygen gas, as
Woo,
well as some
chlorine!
chromium-3 compounds. When it was done, there was still some red color there, which I think was from some partially degraded chromochloride, where the chromium was still in its 6+ oxidized state. Now, what I wanted to do next was to add it directly to a solvent, and I decided to try it with ethanol. So again,
Uh-oh.
I added some of it to a watch glass, and then I dropped some of the chromochloride
Watch
on it.
this. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
As a very strong oxidizer, I honestly thought the reaction was going to be really violent, but it ended up being surprisingly tame. I think it was just oxidizing the ethanol, mostly to acetaldehyde, and in doing so, it was generating just enough heat for things to light on fire. I then did it again, and the result was pretty much the same. When an oxidizer and a fuel are able to ignite spontaneously like this, the mixture is referred to as hypergolic. In the past, I've covered a couple other oxidizers that are strong enough to do this, like pure nitric acid and manganese heptoxide, and every time, I like to try it with something called aniline. This is because aniline, along with nitric acid, was used in old hypergolic rockets. I covered that reaction in an older video, but since then, I always like to compare the nitric acid with other strong oxidizers. So, to a new dish, I loaded it up with aniline, and then I carefully added the chromochloride.
You were just...
The reaction ended up being even more tame than before, and there was a much bigger delay before ignition. The same thing also
More
happened when I
tame,
made
the
manganese heptoxide, which is another really strong oxidizer. With the ethanol, the reaction was really fast and gave a nice snap, but the aniline one was a bit slower.
Love that.
Compared to the ethanol run, this one also made a lot more nasty dark fumes, and I think this was just from all the aniline burning. Another fun and fiery thing to do with chromochloride is to add it to some sulfur.
Yes. Yes.
There was a slight delay, but then it quickly reacted and caused most of the sulfur to light on fire. There isn't too much more to say about this though, besides that it was just fun to do. Now, the last thing that I wanted to try was adding it directly to some toluene. Toluene's a common solvent often found in paint thinners, and with chromochloride, it has a special reaction. This reaction is known as the Atard reaction, where the chromochloride first forms a dark brown-black complex with the toluene. I thought that this might generate enough heat to ignite it, but it apparently wasn't able to. I let it sit there for several minutes, and then I added some sodium sulfite solution like earlier, which destroyed the complex and any remaining chromochloride. In theory, this result should have been a mild oxidation of the toluene, where it was converted to something called benzaldehyde. Benzaldehyde in general is a useful chemical building block, but what I think is more interesting is that it has a really nice cherry smell, and it's commonly used as an artificial flavor or fragrance. I tried smelling what I had here, but I wasn't able to detect anything besides toluene. However, I think this was because I didn't let it react for long enough, and I also didn't neutralize it with ice-cold sodium sulfite. Doing it on a dish like this also just isn't ideal, and in the future, I plan on doing a proper full-scale preparation. I think the idea behind it's really cool, where I can start with paint thinner and then use a nasty carcinogen like chromochloride to turn it into cherry flavoring. Now, the very last thing that I had to do was put the chromochloride into storage. However, it unfortunately has the tendency to leak out of everything, even if the container or bottle is really well sealed. As far as I know, the best and only real way to prevent this is to seal it in something like an ampule.
Yes.
To do this, I had to first make the ampule myself using a large test tube and a blowtorch. After heating it for probably around 30 seconds, it really started to soften, and I was able to stretch it out and to give it a thin neck. I then put it somewhere for it to slowly cool back down to room temperature, and that was basically it. The next step was to fill it with the chromochloride, and to do this, I just had to pour it in.
You guys probably hear that.
Then, after it was added, I had to seal it by melting the glass and pulling away the top part. Doing this, though, can be a bit tricky to do, and over the years, I've messed it up more than a few times. When it had cooled back down to room temperature, I tipped it over to make sure that it didn't have any leaks. Sometimes there can still be a really small hole, so it's important to check, but this one seemed like it was fine. Then after that, I just put it in a container for storage, and that was about it.
You ever just...
But anyway, this brings me to the end of my whole project with chromochloride, and I hope you guys liked it. I was really happy that I was finally able to work with it again, and eventually, I will do the Atard reaction. One major thing that I didn't cover in this video, though, was the cleanup, and it was a pretty important part. I just really didn't feel like it fit into this one, so I went ahead and put together a second video, which can be found on my other channel called Nile Blue. On that channel, I'm trying to post all the things that I find don't really fit into this one, and there's also a few other cleanup videos already there. Now, there's just one final thing that I wanted to mention. At the beginning of 2019, I decided to stop taking almost all sponsorships and to try and support the channel only from ad revenue and Patreon. The reason I did this was pretty simple, and it's because I never really liked doing ads or including them in the videos. I am still, however, okay with sponsorships that can offer me opportunities or chemicals that I normally wouldn't have access to. Ones like this, though, are going to be few and far between, and nothing that I can really rely on. So to help stay independent, and on the off chance that YouTube demonetizes me, I've decided to start YouTube memberships, and there's now that join button on my channel. The perks between here and Patreon, though, are going to be a bit different, because Patreon is on a per video basis, and here it's monthly,
boring.
extra stuff on top. If you're just a casual viewer and you don't...
Is that it? Let's watch an explosion again. Yes. Yeah.
As usual, a big thanks goes out to all my supporters on Patreon. Everyone who supports me can see my videos at least 24 hours before I post them to YouTube. Also, everyone on Patreon can directly message me, and if you support me with $5 or more, you'll get your name at the end like you see here.
Pog. Alright. I would play this, but I don't think I have enough time. We need to gather our cats. Our cats have a vet appointment. I'm tired. I'll probably stream later. Poggers. Alright. Well, I'm gonna go. Just gonna wait a little longer.